If you like our content, consider supporting us on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/SEGAbits.
Let's get scratching.
We got an explosive broadcast coming to you. Listen up. Sega games, just keep playing them. Sega!
We're back. It's the SEGAbits Swingin Report Show. Get ready for Sega interviews and news. Hello and welcome to the SEGAbits Swingin Report Show. I'm Barry. George will not be joining us this week, but we are joined by a very special guest, Mr. Sam Dyer, a graphic designer and the founder of Bitmap Books. Hello, Sam.
Hello, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So, this is our interview podcast. We don't do these as nearly as much as I wish we could, but I think a lot of the reason is I like to get interesting, important people on to talk, and it's difficult to get those every week. But I'm very happy that you're joining us. I've been actually wanting to talk to you for a while about this project, but I thought, in the past, I've always talked about books before they release, and there's sometimes just not as much to be said until after it releases. And so we're actually it actually works out for us because Kickstarter backers, this was a Kickstarter project, they have the books in hand now, and the book will be releasing on the 17th of June. So we're actually kind of in a quasi-release state. How's that going for you then? So are things incredibly busy?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's a bit of a weird one, really, because obviously we're talking about the Master System book today, which is, as you say, it's going to be released next Monday. But kind of the project was sort of finished quite a long time ago for me, and in the world of sort of publishing, I've sort of moved on to the next project. So it's quite an interesting thing because my head's kind of very much in Metal Slug at the moment.
Right.
Tune myself back into the SEGA Master System.
So is that typically how you operate? It's a smaller operation, and you kind of go all in terms of your focus on either a developer or a game series or piece of hardware?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, Bitmap Books is really just me. I'm very lucky to have a big pool of freelance writers and designers and illustrators that I can pull in as and when. But day to day, it's just me. And I tend to, when I take on a project, completely immerse myself into it, and to the point of being almost a bit obsessed. And that sort of, it's about sort of a, say, 3 or 4 month sort of period around each book. And as I said a minute ago, I've just literally coming to the end of Metal Slug book now. So that's been my life back and forth with SNK in Japan, and which is never a bad thing, but been playing through all the Metal Slug games and been going through hundreds and hundreds of screenshots. And yeah, it is all in. All in, and just get completely no stone unturned around research and sort of things like that. So yeah.
So as a one-man operation, are you the one to decide what the next project will be, and also do your personal interests dictate what those are?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think to answer the first question, it's definitely 100% my decision. I mean, Bitmap Books is my company. As I said, I'm the only sort of decision maker.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very lucky in that sense, I guess, that there's no, sort of shareholders or anything that are, dictating what I do next.
Right.
It's also great because I can go at my own pace as well. So, if something's going on in my real life, or my other graphic design work is particularly busy, then I can sort of work the book projects around that, which works really well. Sorry, I forgot what the second question was.
Oh no, I think it was just. Well, I guess what I would ask is, do you jump into a project with something that you're either unfamiliar with or maybe not uncomfortable, but like a game that you have not played as much and you feel like you're not an expert on?
Oh yes, yeah. Sorry, that was it. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I first started Bitmap Books, started. Um, I did a book on the Commodore 64, and that was my first computer that I had as a child, and that was definitely my comfort zone. And
Mhm.
at the time, being honest, I didn't know that Bitmap Books would ever do more than that one book. I always been a bit selfish in a way. I wanted a book on the Commodore 64, so I sort of did one myself and sort of hoped that other people would want it as well. But over the years, as the business has grown, I've realised that I've had to cover subjects that I'm not necessarily an expert in.
Mhm.
So, for instance, something like our third book was on the ZX Spectrum. Now, that was a massive computer in the UK, but I was very much a Commodore 64 guy. So, I've got a lot of knowledge in the computer, but I'm not an expert by any means. So, what I've tended to do over the years is if I'm embarking on a project that, I don't have a massive, massive amount of knowledge on, then I will work with people that do. I would never rely on, what I can find online. I would always work with, if I'm not an expert, then work with someone who is,
Right.
and, who acts like a consultant and collaborate on the book to sort of make that happen. And, if I'm not, necessarily an expert in that particular game or system, it doesn't make the book any less important or enjoyable. They're all important. It's just, if anything, it's fun learning about something that you're not necessarily, don't know that much about, and you can learn. And that's kind of like a really fascinating part of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd imagine too, being in the books medium, it works to your advantage because by the time you're finished with the project, you kind of have become an expert just through the research and all the work you've been doing. Whereas, I mean, to speak to my own experience, I do, like I don't consider myself a YouTuber at all, more like podcast and writer and stuff. But there's an immediacy to a lot of the things I'm doing, and so I'll be talking for a YouTube video and something will come up that I know nothing about, and I'll just have to, I try not to BS my way through it, but I try to be real and, admit that I don't really know much of what I'm talking about. So I try not to make things up. But it's surprising how people will take you to task with not having holistic knowledge of all things Sega or all things video games. So I'm kind of envious of you in that regard.
Yeah, well, I've already admitted that I'm not an expert in everything, but I think the most important thing is to not, BS and say that you are, and just admit, that you're not necessarily. But I think to add, to make the books credible,
Hmm.
you have to, they have to be verified by an expert. So if that's not me, then it'll be someone else that I'll sort of pull in. And yeah, I think learning is one of the most enjoyable things of this, because I've just learned so much about obscure Famicom games or Japanese Master System games, and just some weird and wonderful things that I never would have known anything about if I hadn't embarked on Bitmap Books.
Oh, absolutely. There's so much to cover. I mean, um, from just the Sega perspective, I've said, there are people saying, why don't Sega release more games? Why don't they release XYZ? And I have to ask people, have you played all the games that Sega has released? Because if you just take the library up to the end of the Dreamcast, I very much doubt that people have even scratched the surface of
Right.
what's out there just to play and to learn about. So it's very exciting. And you mentioned the Commodore 64. That was kind of your thing. That was your platform, correct?
Yeah, that was my first introduction to computers and video games, and that was in 1989.
Okay. And what were your earliest games that you enjoyed playing?
Oh, I think the ones it came with, my earliest memories of a game called International Soccer, which
Mm,
was a cut. I don't know if you're not familiar with these early Commodore 64 games, but it was a very, looking back now, it was a very crude, very big chunky pixels football game, left to right, scrolled, and which made this really really funny thud noise every time he kicked the ball. But it was great, and so you spend hours on that. And another really weird one that I had was a game called Theatre Europe, which sounds really bizarre. An 8-year-old playing a Cold War simulator. But it was this big map of Europe, and it had all these dots on it, and you had to make strategic war moves. And I didn't know what I was doing. I was just waggling the joystick, pressing the keys, and every now and again you'd get a cutscene of an explosion or, some sort of like tank or something. But at the time it was great. I'd never seen anything like it in my life, so I was fascinated with it. And I had, I think I had a few different compilations with some sort of Pac-Man clones and sort of Galaxian sort of clone and all that sort of stuff. So that was really my earliest memories. But at the time, it didn't really matter what the games were. To be honest, they just felt so magical, and I was pretty much obsessed from that point on. I obviously had a gap around sort of teenage years, as I think most people do, around video games. But it's always been in my life, and I've always been, ever since those early days on the Commodore 64, I've been really obsessed with it all.
And there is quite a difference between the American experience and your experience, because I do know home computers weren't as big a thing for gaming here as it was there. I know, I had an IBM system, but it was really my dad's, and there were a few games on it I enjoyed playing. So I'm curious, like, did home consoles like Sega or Nintendo products have any real prominence for you, or was it largely more of the computer gaming?
Well, I think speaking for the country, for the UK as a general, as you sort of touched on a minute ago, it was really mainly computers. So we had 3 main computers. We had the Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum, and the Amstrad CPC, and all 3 were 8-bit computers, tape, cassette based, and they really were quite affordable. The games were really cheap as well. So when we were growing up, we were paying, the cheapest games were sort of £2.99, sort of £3, sort of like $5, something like that. And if you were lucky, the bigger sort of licensed games were about £10. So compare that to the cost of like an NES cartridge, which was about £40 at the time. It just, the NES was over here. It was in, you could see it in shops and in catalogs, but it was so few people had it. It was really only the kids who had rich parents who could have one, because it was just so expensive. Going from asking for a game from your mum and dad, which was £3 to £40 was just insane, really. So computers were mega popular, and I think the ZX Spectrum sold something like 50 million units in the UK.
Wow.
It was literally every kid you speak to had a ZX Spectrum, because the games were just so cheap and they were so, there. But the Master System was really, really big over here, but I think it probably came later. So sort of like late 80s, early 90s. And my experiences was that the Master System was cheaper than the NES. The games were cheaper as well. And it was definitely more, it felt like a natural progression from the 8-bit computers. I think a lot of people upgraded those computers to the Master System, and the NES got kind of a bit overlooked, I think. And I think a large part of that is down to marketing. Sega, via Virgin, Mastertronic, had very, very good distribution and marketing in the UK, and got a real good sort of stranglehold and a real good base for them, the Mega Drive releasing over here, which again was really big.
So is a lot of this based on your knowledge looking back? Did you grow up with a Sega Master System?
Yeah, so we had a Sega Master System at home, me and my sister. But a lot of what I'm sort of saying is also my knowledge from research in the book and speaking to. We interviewed a guy called Nick Alexander, who was the CEO of SEGA Europe, and also the one of the top guys at Virgin, So he was there when the Master System was launching, and he was very much involved in promoting it in the UK. So some of what I'm saying is based around that, and also my own memories of growing up, and just a lot of my friends had the Master System, and it was a system that it felt like a big jump up from the 8-bit computers. You know, you had these cartridge games, and you know, like Alex Kidd and stuff like that, and it definitely was quite popular over here.
So how did you, I guess I'm curious, how did you get into graphic design, and how did that lead to Bitmap Books becoming what it is?
I think it all started from when I had my Commodore 64. I don't know how many of your listeners are aware, but the cassette loading games took about 10 minutes to load. So you'd rewind the tape, put it in, and you'd have to wait while it loaded. And if you were lucky, you got some flashing colored bars at the side while it was loading. If you're really lucky, you got some music, and also you'd get like a loading image. So I used to sit there in my bedroom waiting for these games to load, and I just used to be obsessed with looking at these loading images. So it'd just be like a static image of, I don't know, Batman or RoboCop, whatever the game was you were playing. And I just couldn't believe that someone could draw an image like that on a computer. And, you know, looking back, you know, it's obviously incredibly crude and blocky, but as a child, it really captured my imagination. Interestingly, I never went into game sort of design, but that really was my first sort of foray into messing around doing computer graphics and drawing and painting. And I've just sort of carried that all the way through, really, into my professional life, obviously then wanting to do sort of professional graphic design. And then once I'd worked in the industry for a few years and worked in London for various design firms, I had the idea to start Bitmap Books because I felt like I had enough experience being a graphic designer, and it felt like a good time to sort of, you know, to be honest, I'd done years and years of working for clients that, you know, I'm not necessarily that passionate about, like law firms and you know, all that sort of stuff, as I'm sure you're aware.
Yes.
It's great, it pays the bills, but it's not, you know, designing another law firm's brochure isn't really what I get out of bed for. So the thought of being able to design a book on a retro computer system that I had as a child was just like a dream come true. So, I mean, that's really how it started, really. It was just a case of, you know, why not? To test the water, see if there's an audience out there for such a book. And luckily there was and there is. And yeah, that's kind of like, that was sort of 5 years ago. And yeah.
And so how would you say Bitmap Books differs from other retro game history publishers? Because we've really, I think we've hit a renaissance of gaming books. It's not just guides anymore. And we now have stuff from read-only memory. I'm trying to think. Hardcore Gaming does some books. Yeah. Ken Horowitz, though it's mostly text. So how would you say Bitmap differs from what those guys are doing?
I think our Bitmap Books' point of difference has been the visual nature of the book. So the other publishers you mentioned, such as Read Only Memories, produce amazing books. But I think ours almost, the point of difference has almost been a bit of a criticism in the sense over the years, is that my initial vision for the Commodore 64 book all those years ago was that the image was the main thing. So for me, looking at that RoboCop screen was the thing that brought back all those memories. It wasn't looking at pages and pages of text. That wasn't going to make me feel nostalgic. So I believed that, you know, that old saying of a picture speaks 1,000 words. So the idea was a tiny bit of text with a big image. That's where I started with it. And I think at the time, no one was doing anything like that. And I think looking back, it was quite sort of, it made Bitmap Books stand out. And my my designer's eye, I guess, and my sensibilities allowed me to be able to pull that off aesthetically, with text and image working together in like quite a nice way that didn't look messy. But over the years, there has been, criticism around that approach, in the sense that it's quite, people say that the books are just picture books, and there's no sort of substance there. So it has been something that I've tried to address over the years, address the balance. So particularly in the Master System book, which we've just released, it's much more of a balance between text and pictures. But I would say that the core of the book is still screenshots from games and those sort of nostalgia-inducing images. But it's hard to explain. I think the books have almost just sort of like matured a little bit, and they're not so picture-based now. There is more to read as well, and I think it's a really nice balance that we've sort of struck.
Was it at all a reaction to gaming magazines in terms of your visual aesthetic? Because at least from my own experience, I feel like a lot of early gaming mags didn't do much justice to games. The screenshots would be very small. I'm trying to remember who did it right. Official Dreamcast magazine and Xbox Nation, which was an unofficial one from the Dreamcast magazine staff in the US, were kind of doing it right. I'd say, filling pages with screenshots, using them in conjunction with the text. Was there any thought involved with that?
Not really. I mean, there wasn't. I mean, it was just my desire just to sort of strip it right back to what actually, because obviously in magazines they use things like box outs and big images with smaller images underneath. I really wanted to just strip it right back to the bare bones of, and let that image and those pixels, which is another big thing as well, is to really keep those pixels nice and clean, and not put like CRT filters over the pixels to make them look fuzzy. I really wanted the book to show the craft around how these artists, put these little color blocks in a certain sequence to make them look so amazing. So I think that sort of approach was definitely a sort of a differentiation, because we were focusing mainly on the graphics of the games. We weren't, talking about audio or programming necessarily. It was really championing the artists. But I think another thing that's made us stand out over the years are the different print finishes that we used on the book. So we were the first publisher to use lenticular on the cover of our books. So for those of your listeners that don't know what lenticular is, it's like a plastic sheet, and it's almost got like 2 or 3 images in it, and when you move, it sort of animates, sort of like different frames. So the first book we did that for was the NES book, and so on the front cover you'd have like a sprite of Mario, for instance, and when you moved the book, it looked like he was jumping. And it was quite a cool thing to do. And I think those things like that, and foil blocking and coloured ribbons, and all the different slipcase designs and special editions we've done, I think sort of makes Bitmap Books stand out from the other publishers.
How do you go about capturing the images so that they retain the pixels and remain as sharp as possible?
Yeah, so that was one of the first things that I sort of had to work out before I committed to doing the first book. So essentially what I worked out how to do was to take screenshots from within an emulator and make sure they're taken on a certain setting so that the pixels are pin sharp and they're not sort of like fuzzy. And if they're pin sharp, almost vector-like, that means you can then enlarge that image in Photoshop to as big as you want, effectively, and then make it 300 dpi for print. And then also within like the Commodore 64 book, I also, because the Commodore 64 only had about 12 colors, I could literally have that palette of swatches in Photoshop and color balance each screenshot, so every single red in the book was the same red throughout. So little things, little attention, little things like that, I think, maybe no one ever noticed, but it was sort of thing that I sort of cared about.
So the Master System book, it's number 6 in the series.
Yes.
Number 1 was Commodore?
Yeah, so the number 1 was Commodore 64. Number 2 was the Commodore Amiga, which I believe you guys had in the States as well, but lesser so for the games. Third was ZX Spectrum, which was very sort of UK and sort of Russia and Spain sort of had it as well, but to maybe a sort of lesser degree. And then for book 4, we moved on to the consoles. So I looked at the NES and the Famicom. So that was the sort of first time that I'd really looked into a Japanese system as well, which was fascinating. And then book 5 was the Super Nintendo and the Super Famicom. And then, yeah, as you said, book 6 was SEGA Master System.
So how has the process changed from book 1 to book 6?
I think, touching on what I said earlier, it's really around the content. I mean, when I did the Commodore 64 book, it really was just me, because it was essentially a few written features and mainly just screenshots from games. I could do it largely myself, whereas now it's become a much bigger project around collaboration. So I'll have a team of writers that will write the features, constantly interviewing people, getting those interviews transcribed and edited for the book. So it's just turned into a more, I mean, it's quite a well-oiled process, but it's just turned into a bigger process and more research needed, and just, sort of standard things around when projects get bigger, they require more research, more time, more resources and more people. That's really, but the essence is the same of the book. They're just, you could argue they're just bigger and better than they were, from book 1. So require more time.
So the Master System book, this is officially licensed. And how would you say this process working on this whole book compared to ones that are unofficial? Because I do know that the NES one are denoted on the cover as being the unofficial visual compendium.
Yeah, so I think there's pros and cons for unofficial and official. If I start with unofficial, so the NES book, the good thing about being unofficial is that you don't have to worry about, you can pretty much include whatever games you want. But obviously there are restrictions around being unofficial. Some things you don't have access to official assets from the company, and you probably wouldn't have access to interviews with employees of Nintendo, for instance, because they don't give out interviews for unofficial products. With the SEGA Master System book, we had the opportunity to work with SEGA, and I kind of weighed it up and thought it would be best to go official with this one, because they could give us access to certain interviews with current employees who worked on, games that are in the book. One of the main, I suppose, disadvantages, which is kind of what I mentioned a second ago, is around the games. So one of the things I had to do, which was a complete ball ache, is get permission from all of to include the third-party games. So it was a real headache, because I literally had to go through and all the games. So for instance, like Rocky, if I wanted to include Rocky, I had to get permission from Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer to include Rocky, because they obviously own the copyright to Rocky Balboa. Some of them were easy, because I've already got a relationship with Capcom. So, Capcom were very, very kind and allowed, Forgotten Worlds and Strider. And, you know, on 99% of the games that I wanted to include, I could, and it was just, you know, blood, sweat and tears, emailing Japanese companies, getting emails translated, and calling on my various contacts to, you know, do introductions and all that sort of stuff. The only real downer really was that for various licensing reasons we couldn't include the Wonder Boy games, which sort of is quite upsetting. Because obviously they're so iconic on the Master System that it was a real shame that they couldn't be included, and it will forever haunt me that they're not in the book. But, you know, hey, there are hundreds of games in the book, and, you know, that's just 2 or 3 games that couldn't make it. But
right.
So as I said, it's sort of, you know, I think on the plus side we had access to lots of official assets, artworks, interviews, all that sort of stuff. Also, we managed to secure Mark Cerny to write the foreword in the book, and I don't believe that Mark would have written the foreword if the book hadn't been official and endorsed. I think it's a selling point. And then obviously you've got the fact that it's official, that it could arguably make the book more collectible, and also it makes it that Sega will be actively promoting it as well. So from a marketing point of view, it makes sense. So yeah. I think, you know, pros and cons for each thing. But
so have you noticed an increase in maybe like sales and eyeballs seeing the book and people talking about because of this official status and Sega actively promoting the book?
I think that's quite hard to answer at the moment because the book's not officially released till next Monday. I mean, the Kickstarter did extremely well. It's very hard to say whether it would have done better or worse if the book wasn't official. So yeah, it's hard to say at the moment. I would like to think that the fact it's official makes it more desirable, I think.
Okay, that's interesting. So in regards to the Sega Master System, as an American growing up, it was not that popular here.
No.
And, you know, I recall I grew up on the Genesis and I knew about the Master System. I didn't know what it was. I don't think I really learned what it was until the late 90s. And because there just was no real knowledge base out there, there weren't that many fan sites talking about it. There were definitely no books covering the history of it. Whereas, like you were saying, the Master System was much more popular in Europe. And something I've noticed with a lot of these retro gaming books is they come from people who grew up in Europe, in Britain, and as such, it's kind of telling their story. When you approached this book, did you look more at a worldwide sort of story about the Master System, a worldwide experience, or would you say this book is more catering towards a specific audience?
No, I mean, I always try and treat it as to appeal to as many people as possible. I mean, naturally, it was very, very popular in the UK, the Master System. So you know, maybe the majority of the focus is on that market. But where possible, I've tried to include as many different markets at all. So we cover a lot of the American launch of the Master System, because although you mentioned it wasn't massively successful, it still was a big thing, you know, from a marketing point of view in America. And we've interviewed Steve Hanover and John Sawyer as well, who Steve worked for Sega and John worked for Tonka, who were obviously involved in the distribution of the Master System in America. So we cover that story quite a lot, and it's fascinating, you know, their views on why the Master System sort of failed in America. And it isn't just as simple as the NES outsold it. There are other sorts of reasons around that. And also interviewing like Nick Alexander, as I said earlier, who was one of the major distributors in sort of Europe. And we've interviewed 3 or 4 Japanese developers as well through Sega. So try to cover all the angles, and also when we've covered games, we've included Japanese only games as well, and also European only games, and also Brazilian only games. And then when we've talked about hardware, we've made sure we've photographed the Mark III as well. So we've covered the sort of the Japanese sorts of side of things. I think it just makes it more interesting when you cover the Japanese stuff as well, because everyone's so used to seeing the Master System. But, some people might not have seen the Mark III and what the Mark III cartridges look like. So I think it's just makes it more interesting for me designing it, and for the reader as well.
That's cool. Yeah, because I mean, like I was saying, there isn't that much of an American experience in regards to the Master System, but there's some amazing stories. So that's great that Tonka's covered. I visited the former Tonka headquarters. I didn't go inside. I just looked at the outside, and I'm actually going to be back near there this coming weekend. So maybe I'm going to take a little trip in the car and snap some photos again. I mean, it's nothing really to look at, but it's just kind of cool to know that Sega history was happening out there. And so how would you describe the European experience with the Master System in terms of the marketing? Was it aggressive? Was it funny? How did you see that, and how did it affect you growing up?
The marketing for the Master System in the UK was quite. They had a tagline which was "Do me a favor, plug me into a Sega." The whole Virgin advertising for the Sega Master System was quite sort of in your face, and making it quite youthful and fun. That's my sort of memories of it. And there were lots of magazines over here at the time as well, focusing on Sega and the sort of the emerging console market. But it is a strange one in the UK because we were such a computer orientated country. But I think when it came to things like arcade conversions, the 8-bit computers just couldn't really handle them. So when we saw Outrun on the Master System, or Space Harrier or Afterburner, it was a big thing over here, because it was like, wow, this is a real step up. And it felt like it was the first time you really felt like you had an arcade in your home, because it just wasn't the same on the computers.
Yeah, the American marketing, from what I recall, it was a lot of just kind of, I know there were those posters that said, take hold of the Sega adventure. A lot of the manuals and the boxes, just, I don't know, and maybe this was the same over there. I'm not sure how the copy was in those, but they were all very much like, you are the hero of this game. This is what you're doing. Have fun. It was very direct and to the point in terms of how the games were presented to you. I remember, I think it was like Shinobi. It wouldn't talk about the character and their name. It would be more like, you are a ninja. Go have some fun. And it was very, I guess, stripped down, almost like just placing the player into a situation and saying, go have fun with it. There was no real character to the marketing. There was no real voice. I have all the old newsletters, and they were all just kind of, I mean, they were called, I think, the Sega newsletter. There was nothing too enticing or exciting about it. And I have to wonder where that was coming from. And did any of that bleed into Europe?
I think it really comes down to the distributors and the difference in the company. So Tonka were obviously a toy distributor or maker, and I think you're right that the way the Master System was marketed in America was quite sort of straight, I think. And I don't want to say it was advertised as boring, but it wasn't. but like you say, there wasn't a character. Like Nintendo had Nintendo Power, didn't they? And they had Howard Phillips, and he was a personality, and they had Mario and all these different characters. But yeah, I just think it failed to capture the imaginations of the kids, and I just think the NES over there was a big thing as well.
Yeah,
but Virgin, I don't about how you aware you are of the company Virgin, but they're quite a sort of a fun sort of brand, and I think they brought that sort of fun and youthfulness into the Master System, the advertising, and yeah, that's it. It definitely felt fun, and as I said, it stood out and it felt definitely different.
Now, I did want to touch on this briefly. As a Kickstarter backer, I was following the news. There was a warehouse fire, which led to a reprint and a delay in shipping. This happened in China, correct?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
we just had a lovely Christmas with my family and got back to work and sat at my desk on the 3rd or 4th of January, I think it was, and I had a phone call from my printer saying that there'd been a fire in the port. And to put it into context, these warehouses are like the sizes of football pitches, and a couple of these warehouses had gone up in flames. And all I knew for a while was that the books could have been affected because they were in a warehouse. They were waiting to be brought back to the UK. So my last communication with the backers had been, here's the book. It looks amazing. We just got to wait a little bit for transportation. So to go from that to hearing that there'd been a fire was obviously heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And I was kind of in the dark for a long time as well, because I didn't actually know whether they had actually been damaged. And it took a few weeks to actually find out for sure. But I think throughout all of my books and all of my Kickstarters, I've always tried to be really upfront, honest, and communicate all the time with backers. And I just kept that up, really. I was just really honest, explain what happened. And, not one person, said anything, slightly negative about it. Everyone was really supportive. Everyone was really understanding. And, the poor backers, such as yourself, had to wait like an extra 3 months to get the book. And I know, it's 3 months is only 3 months, but it is frustrating for everyone. But everyone was really super understanding about it. And it just, when the book was finally delivered to Kickstarter backers a couple of weeks ago, to see the positive comments and the multiple messages I receive from people, it just blows your mind, and it just makes every single bit of hard work and hard decision and all that sort of stuff just so worth it. And it's one of the most rewarding parts of creating these books.
Yeah, and I gotta say, as someone who's backed several Kickstarters, I just have to applaud your transparency and your ability to make coherent, cohesive posts on a continuing basis. It's very refreshing in a world where there's a lot of Kickstarters where people just kind of, it gets filled and then they just sit back and they don't say anything for months, sometimes years.
Yeah.
And so you've done a fantastic job. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. And the whole situation, as unfortunate as it was, I think you handled it really well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things that I've also really wanted to do was to, making backing the Kickstarter feel like a special thing, and to not make people feel like, because there'll be nothing worse than backing a Kickstarter, and you see this all the time, that then someone releases it like a week later and you can buy it cheaper.
Yeah.
It's a complete kick in the teeth to the Kickstarter backers. So I've always tried my hardest to make sure my books are never discounted. And I think on the whole, I don't discount them myself. Maybe other people do, but it's never much. And also there's always if I'm going to release it to the general public, I always give the Kickstarter backers like a few weeks of exclusivity, so they feel like they've got the bragging rights for a few weeks while everyone else is sort of looking at it. So yeah, no, it's nice that you say that, and it's definitely a conscious thing that I've always tried to just be honest and upfront and clear. And I think yeah, people like yourself do really appreciate that.
So the delay, did that bring any positive things to the book as it is now? Were there any additional changes you made to the printing process or the colors?
Not really. There was a couple of very minor things that I changed with the print that
Mhm.
only I would ever notice. There was, which I probably shouldn't admit to this, but there was one or two small typos that I spot.
Oh, there always are typos. Yeah.
Which people always like to highlight on Twitter. But yeah, there's a couple of typos I caught, which was obviously nice. I would have preferred the fire not to happen, but it was nice to catch those typos. And I think there was a couple of very small graphical things that I felt I could tweak, and did that. So yeah, I think I always try and look on the bright side of things and find positives and negatives, and I think the book is a few percent better than it was before the fire.
Oh, that's good. And so other retro gaming book companies out there have covered the Genesis, the Dreamcast. Um, I do note that they always skip the Master System. They always skip the Saturn. So I'm very happy to finally have a Master System book in my hands. I am interested though. Are you ever going to cover similar ground? Do you think the Genesis is in your near future?
I hope so. That's always been the plan. The problem is that it would be going through Sega again. I see no reason to sort of change that, and they are very busy at the moment with their own projects, such as the Mega Drive Mini or the Genesis Mini. So yeah, I mean, they are very, very aware that I want to follow this up with a Genesis/Mega Drive version.
Yeah.
It's on the cards. It's just a case of just being patient, and the feedback I've had from them on the Master System book is great. They're really happy with it. So I've just got to just cross my fingers and just keep plugging away, and hopefully they can agree to a Mega Drive book. But just to reassure everyone that is looking forward to it, it is very much on my agenda and something I'm pushing for. But unfortunately, I can't say yes or no because it's just not been approved by them.
Of course. Yeah, you've got to imagine though that come the holiday season, there's definitely going to be renewed interest, and thankfully Sega have really put a lot of hard work into the Mini. From what we've been seeing, it looks like it's actually going to be.
I know the penny's dropped at last. They've realised that. Yeah. No, it is amazing what they're doing with it. Actually, it's the game. The lineup on it is. I was completely shocked.
What surprised you the most? Just to talk about that briefly.
I think what surprised me the most probably the Konami games. Well, just all of the third party stuff on it, really, because for years Sega have just been flogging their first party things, Altered Beast, Alex Kidd, Sonic. Now they're obviously embracing their third party games, and I think that was the biggest shock for me. Was just the inclusion of those sorts of types of games on the Mini. And I think, yeah, long may it continue. That they'll obviously, I think it's great, and I've heard that that they're really going to town on the UI and the sort of menu screen music and the whole package, I think. And I even saw some things last week that there's going to be like a little, I don't know if it was a joke or there was like a mini, like a 32X add-on for it and a Mega CD add-on.
Yeah, those are legitimate. They don't do anything, but they sit there and make it look bigger on your shelf.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
It's great, and obviously they've seen the success of the NES and the SNES Mini, and they've realised that if these things are done properly, they can be really mega popular. So I think it's for all Sega fans, it's a good time to be alive, I think.
Absolutely. And talking about the Sega CD32X, and maybe even the Saturn, because a lot of people forget the Saturn was a 2D powerhouse. Do you have any interest in covering those as books? I know a 32X book would probably be 32 pages, but still, they are very, very interesting pieces of hardware that I feel get overlooked.
Yeah, I think if and when I cover a